Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July 25th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting with MakerDAO. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. In these calls, we talk about risk. We talk about risk parameters as well. We talk about new collateral types that might be coming in and out of the system. We talk about governance issues. Over time, the weight of which issues we focus on shifts back and forth depending on what's cooking at MakerDAO, what's cooking in the community. That's my way of pointing out that we're not always going to be talking about risk the way that we have in the past. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be shifting gears slightly to everybody's favorite topic, which is governance. There's lots of things we need to figure out in the governance world. It may come as no surprise to this group that governance is not a solved problem. MakerDAO, again, is sort of on the leading edge of a lot of issues in the crypto space. One of them is how do we organize lots of people around the world, and how do we organize them when the stakes are high, I guess is an interesting way of putting it. What we do here is kind of important, and so we need to take governance seriously. What those mechanisms look like, what the processes look like, what the debates look like, how signals get surfaced, how they get ratified. These are all important questions that we need to figure out. And we're going to start doing that in earnest. The reason why we're going to start doing that in earnest is because multi-collateral DAI is a real thing, and it's coming. I touched on this briefly in our last call, but when multi-collateral DAI launches is dependent on two different factors. Basically, you can put it into two different buckets. One is the mechanics, the code, the audits, our partners. All of these things need to align. So it's what pieces of the puzzle we can put in place in the foundation. But there's the other bucket, the other side of this coin, whatever analogy you want to mix together there, and that's governance in the community. When entity launches is largely dependent on what happens in the forums, what happens in these calls, what happens in various discussions, and what ultimately happens in the voting portal. There's a lot of work that we all need to do together in order to make that happen. Lots of risk analysts, lots of governance fans, if that's even a thing. I guess it is a thing. We can find them all over our forums. So we need to align, and we need to get to work, and we need to establish processes and policies and principles, and we need to optimize this process as much as we possibly can in such a way that we maintain agility, but we also gain some more velocity. And that's a lot of buzzwords, and it's a lot of theoretical analogies, but these things are all going to start kicking off in the next week's call. And the week after that, we're going to wrap things up. And the week after that, we're going to continue to do it. There'll be some proposals and some clarification of some of the things that I'm talking about that will show up in the forum soon. And we can start a large conversation, a long tail conversation about how that impacts the organization, how that impacts governance, and how everybody feels about it. There's a lot of things coming out. That a lot of things coming speech that I just gave is sort of my way of compensating for the fact that I have very little to talk about today, because there's furious levels of planning and infrastructure work and documentation being written. It's all coming to a head in the next week or two. And as soon as that happens, the next step is we're going to take all of these docs and all of these plans, and we're going to put them in front of the community in the forums, and we're going to talk about them in these calls, and we're going to get as much feedback from all of our stakeholders as we possibly can. But until that happens, we're going to continue focusing on risk, and then we're going to begin figuring out how we shift those gears and how we allocate time to each one of these large pieces of the puzzle of governance and risk in the foundation. It's not going to happen today, though. So I'm going to jump into my preamble, and then we're going to hand it off to David Utrobin, who now has a guest slot on these calls. He's going to give us a recap of what's happening in the forums. And this is a great idea. I'm not sure whose idea it was, probably mine. Or maybe, okay, it wasn't, it was David's. All right, so it was a great idea. So the reason why this is important is because this is a theme that we've been talking about for months and months and months. But governance decision making does not happen in these calls. It's the venue is far too temporary. The audience is far too small. The language is English. The time zone is North American. There's all kinds of reasons why this is not the committee where decisions get made. Where those decisions get made, I'm hoping will be the forum itself. That's where the debate can happen. That's where conversations can surface. That's where deep discussions and manifestos can be posted. And it's turning out to be the case, and I'm very excited about that. The flip side of that is we can't lose sight of what's happening in that forum, and we need to create a bridge between those forum discussions and the discussions we have here. And so David is going to do a recap of what we shouldn't be calling, but we are governance at a glance, which was an amazing idea that we totally did not steal from Long for Wisdom in the forums. It's more of an homage than straight up theft, I think.
I mean, just to clarify, my review of what's going on in the forums is actually based on Long for Wisdom's governance at a glance. I mean,
I'm so it is straight up plagiarism.
It's
okay.
Yeah, it's straight up plagiarism.
Let's just own it
then. I mean, what's good though is that we're seeing with the new forum that a lot more deep discussions are actually happening compared to when we were just relying on MKR.gov. So I think that starting to do these kinds of like reviews of what's going on in the forum, even if they're brief 10-15 minutes, is really important because not everybody reads the forum, and a lot of people are siloed into this call to get all their information on governance, and so it's good to kind of do. So yeah, do you want me to launch into it, Rich?
No, I still have to finish my preamble.
Yeah, all right, cool. That's what
you're a little quiet too. I think you need to adjust your mic a couple inches upwards. There you go. So here's the preamble. We are extremely interested in getting as much feedback from this group as we possibly can. So please, if you have any kind of question at all, type it into the chat window. If you have access to a microphone, feel free to interrupt and just jump into the conversation whenever you like. We're going to, speaking of forums, we're going to continue these discussions in the forum. That's where the long tail discussion happens. I will post a link, excuse me, into the chat right now. If you have a question that you think requires a deep dive or doesn't need to be addressed in this call, or you just want to take notes or whatever you like, post it into that forum thread, and then we'll continue things for the rest of the week. All right, that is me, I think. So I will hand it off to you now, David.
All right, cool, thanks. So I'm going to post in the chat really quick the governance at a glance thread that Long for Wisdom is putting together. So this is a thread that's actually constantly updated. So you could look at this link and you'll see even new conversations that are relevant and interesting. So it's a good place to just kind of see what's going on. So the 3 different sections, well, there's actually 4 sections in the thread. There's seeking consensus, help wanted, ongoing initiatives, and on the horizon. So I'm gonna skip over the help wanted because it's kind of peripheral. But just starting with the seeking consensus type threads, there have been a number of them. So the meta is that the community is wanting to use the forums to do some soft consensus before we actually launch into having a robust enough governance polling system to do multiple polls at the same time. So at the moment, about a month ago, the first signal request thread was launched, and yeah, just outlines that. And I think most people, not that I think, but in the thread, it was a majority vote that this was a good kind of conceptual idea just to establish consensus through forum polls. But again, there's concerns around that. There's concerns about people that don't hold Maker coming in and affecting this consensus. There's no, there's no real verification that you're a Maker holder if you're voting in these. So it's not a perfect solution. But hopefully a better solution will be coming with the 1.5 governance portal soon. The next thread is the should we modify the stability fee voting cadence and stepping? Actually, hold on. Give me 1 second. Actually, Rich, if anybody in the chat, can you just stop me if their question is relevant to the thread that I'm talking about? Because I don't want to like pause and read through.
Sure. So there's each one of these threads could probably diverge into an entire governance call. So
Absolutely.
there's commentary that could be made on all of them. The sentiment analysis, or sorry, the what was the signal requests?
Yeah, meta governance signal requests. But yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's
maybe
a great
the
thread, and I encourage people to actually dig into that one because here's the reason why we have a forum. Here's the reason why we have a call, excuse me, and a polling system is that the polling system is a way to surface signals, figure out where the alignment is in the community, and then that is the stepping stone to move something into an executive poll if it actually changes the mechanism of how MakerDAO works, or else if it's more of a principle or a policy type thing, then
right.
that's enough for it to keep on, enough for it to consider consensus being reached. We have this chicken and egg issue that the community has been wrestling with for months. And that question is, how do we aggregate signals for this to enter into the signaling mechanism? So how do things get into the poll? And the forum, we have some emergent processes happening here. And one of those emergent processes, I anxiously encourage people to look at this forum thread. The question is, how do we determine that signal or a consensus has been reached in the forums? And one of the things we talk about in there is
The polls,
the
yeah.
difference between what a community member is and what a maker holder is. And sorry, I'm not going to derail the whole thing. So the reason why I find that so interesting, don't smirk when I say I'm not going to derail the whole thing. The reason why I find that thing so interesting, that thread so interesting, is because it helps us as a group understand the difference between community and governance. I think that governance, people who own maker token voters who participate in the polling system um, have a bunch of alignments they need to think about, enough a bunch of incentives, but there's also it's sort of their responsibility in some ways to act as representatives for the wider community as well, or at least internalize some of the arguments that come from non-maker token holders. And so that's where there's this Venn diagram where there's this overlap of community and governance. And I think that, at least personally, polling in the forums should be open to absolutely anybody. And that can inform wider sentiment that the maker token holders can sort of internalize when they come into the voting portal. So,
Right.
so you
All
can
right.
stop smirking. I'm done now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, polling is really, really important just as data points and just things that guide our decisions because, we're trying to do this in a decentralized fashion and, it's kind of hard to do things in a decentralized fashion. You need somebody to make the decision. And what are you basing that decision off of, basically? So, all right. So for the rest of the review of this governance at a glance, I'm gonna just give kind of like 2 sentences on each thread, so we don't spend too much time on this. And then afterwards, we can answer questions from the chat or anything like that. So the other seeking consensus thread is the should we modify the stability fee voting cadence and stepping. So as of recent, the discussion has leaned towards making it a biweekly cadence for stability fee adjustments. And we saw that there was a 79% to 21% split for a biweekly cadence. And so there's pretty like, and that's based on 16 votes. So it's kind of hard to say if there's real consensus, which is still just some issue to keep in mind in regards to the polling. But it seems that people are actually for a biweekly cadence, and also Vishesh makes a really great point for it in that if we have a very fast reaction every time something is going on with the peg, it doesn't actually give time for our previous adjustments to have an effect. So it's important to kind of slow things down a little bit, and also slowing things down will give us the additional benefit of having different types of votes rather than just stability fee votes, which we're kind of hosed to right now. The next signal request seeking consensus thread is regarding, it's called define a standard stability fee changes based on recent price of DAI. So user late tot kind of put out a signal request seeing if people would be willing to standardize what the poll should, or rather what the executive vote should be based on something like a 3-day volume weighted average price for DAI. And so there was a lot of back and forth in that thread. It was pretty interesting. The open questions that exist that actually make it really hard to do this is the fact that, you know, how do you decide on these parameters? Like, what's the lag time for the effect to kick in? Is it a 1-day VWAP? Is it a 3-day VWAP? Is it a 7-day? And so there was not a lot of strong consensus around that signal request. And then the last signal request I want to talk about is the thread, should we move to exponential rate stepping for stability fee polls? So the way stability fee polls are right now, it goes in 1% increments up and down, 9 different options. The middle option is to keep it. There's 4 up and 4 down. And so the exponential rate stepping is just, you know, you log to it. It's like 2%, 4%, 8%. So it gives more flexibility to governance to make like more radical changes if they needed to. And there was 16 votes in that poll, 75% over 25% for to against. So mostly people are for it. But again, I actually didn't see any serious negative comments against the suggestion, except for maybe remove the 8%, because 8% is like, it's a really big move. And also because if you have 8%, that's actually, I think, 2, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, that's still 9 options. So if you remove the 8%, you actually have less options on the poll overall than we currently have. So instead of 9 options, I think it'll be 7 options. And that might make it actually better for user experience. But again, that actually takes away your options from what we have now, because we have the 1% increments. So interesting thread. All right. And that's it for the signals, for the different types of signals that are being seeked on the forum. As for ongoing initiatives, there's 3 different threads that are pretty active conversations going on. There's the meta for coordinating collateral due diligence. And so a couple weeks ago, the foundation's internal risk team put out the collateral onboarding guide and a bunch of documentation for that. And we started talking about how to onboard collateral in a few of the previous risk calls as well. And so at the moment, so User Along for Wisdom actually came out and made a suggestion for people to volunteer. And so I think we had 27 total votes in the poll, and of them, I think 26 people volunteered to do some level of research for collateral onboarding, which is great. But Cyrus made it a point that you know, hold your horses right now, because integrations and the internal risk team are actually already doing a lot of the due diligence for these first collateral types, and that in the next week or two, they're going to be discussing more about their findings, and they're going to kind of just show what they have in regards to some collateral, is what I understand. So hold your horses there, but I know a lot of people want to be super sleuths and revered sleuths. Yeah, revered sleuth herders is how Long for Wisdom put it. But basically, people that project manage and like kind of organize and centralize all the data for a single collateral onboarding application, and then all of the super sleuths, which just are assigned by the sleuth herder. God, I can't do these names, but they're assigned by the project manager to kind of dig deep into one of the questions or one of the areas in the collateral onboarding application. So like legal risk or technical risk, or, you know, whatever it might be. So it's really great to see community actively like being excited about doing this kind of work. But regardless, we're kind of on pause for this, waiting on the internal risk team. And then there's another thread in ongoing initiatives called Systemic Risk Directory, also made by User Long for Wisdom. It basically puts a 1 to 10 weighted poll. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Andrew, I'm gonna mute you. Or actually, Rich, can you mute Andrew? Yeah, you're good. All right, so yeah, so the Systemic Risk Directory basically puts a sentence to each kind of unique risk and polls, you know, our governance community about how concerned they are with the risk. 1 being not concerned at all, 10 is basically the maximum concern. They think an emergency shutdown could happen because of this risk or something, right? And so on average, there's 3 different risks there currently. So I'm not going to go through them right now, but I encourage you to check it out. And each of the risks is also linked to a discussion thread. So it's not just a poll and a sentence for the risk type, but there's also a place to talk about it. The last thread in ongoing initiatives is estimating the DAI USD price from the ETH to DAI order book instead of DEX trades. So in here, I think it was Lix, right? Let me just double check that. So Lix did a lot of work around calculating the DAI price, and he made a point that calculating it from trades actually introduces a lot of noise because of the nature of how trades are made. The fact that removing a limit order from like ETH to DAI takes multiple blocks, and that there's a lot of noise in the signal basically from watching DAI price through DEX trades. And so he did a similar DAI price analysis, but instead of using DEX trades, he used the order book activity. And it's actually really interesting. There's a couple of graphs in the thread that overlays the signals and shows actually the reduction in noise, and also just it's a really, really great suggestion. So anybody that's doing DAI price and kind of that kind of stuff, check out that thread because he makes there's some advantages to be had with his approach. Yeah, and then the last 2 threads that I'm going to cover in this little recap of what's going on in the forum is the stuff that's on the horizon. So these are threads that are further looking. So they're not immediate concerns, but they're conversations and problems that need to be sorted through. And the main problem right now that's being sorted through is how we create policy around stability fee changes and DSR changes with like the coming of multi-collateral DAI. Because right now in single collateral DAI, the stability fee is used as a policy tool. It's a monetary policy tool. It doesn't, nobody in governance really thinks of the stability fee right now in terms of the risk premium of the underlying asset. But come multi-collateral DAI and the DSR with it, we're actually going to have a kind of an intersection between monetary policy and risk management of all these underlying collaterals and CDP types and CDP packages. And so it's not obvious what the best way to do the math there is and the decision making, but yeah. So the first thread is called Navigating the Waters Between Now Single Collateral DAI and Multi-Collateral DAI with the DSR. So specifically to this thread, Matthew Rabinowitz talks about what the best step-by-step process for launching multi-collateral DAI would be without disrupting the DAI price. Because if multi-collateral DAI launches with like with some ability for CDP, would-be CDP users to mint a lot of excess DAI, we want to be able to control the supply so that it kind of increases gradually if it does, or we want to do it in a way that kind of maintains the homeostasis of like the system as it is, and then slowly transition out. And he outlined a couple of really great, not a couple, I think it was 4 or 5 great steps for actually managing this kind of transition. And then the second thread is anything wrong with DSR and stability fee calculations as planned for MCD? And that's where the discussion that I just referenced earlier is actually outlined pretty fantastically. So Long for Wisdom defines all the terms and actually boils down the problem to like this one sentence, which I'm going to read right now. So under the currently proposed system and policy, there is no adequate tool that could be used to curtail a high demand for a single collateral package without negatively affecting other collateral packages, especially those with lower risk premiums. And so, yeah, and that's basically the summary of what's been going on in the forum. And that's not referencing, yeah, so Kiva actually makes a good point. So the thread that I just talked about, the DSR, like on the Horizon threads, they are gonna have a lot of back and forth because it's not obvious what we're gonna do, and coming to the solution of what's best is gonna take some back and forth in our community and some some constructive thinking on top of constructive criticism, and that's just the path we have to take to come to a real solution.
All right, that's a great point, and I think that we'll cut it. That's a good segue. So we need to get to the risk section.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, David.
Yeah, no problem.
One of the main takeaways here is surfacing the fact that there's a lot of interesting things happening in this forum. So serious business is going on, deep discussions are going on, future direction is being established. So if you have an interest in governance, you have an interest in risk, please participate, because there's it's the way that the debates and discussions are turning out in the forum are better than I could possibly have hoped, and it's working out precisely the way that I'd hoped it was. Sorry, I got distracted for a second. So lots of really interesting things, and the discussions that are happening in the forum now will be surfaced and in these calls soon, and will eventually be changing the course of the DAO. So get in early and have your say, because there's a lot of interesting things happening. With that, I think we're going to turn it over to you, Vishesh, for the state of the peg.
Okay. All right. I'll share my screen. Okay. So if everyone can see everything well, just to kick it off, state of the peg seems all right at the moment, is the synthesis. So trading volume, for the last 24 hours was about 3.8 million DAI for ETH. Earlier it was a little bit higher, a little bit over 4 million. So I think the trading volumes are light, but not so small that we should be concerned that price is not actually around $1. But yeah, it's trading very, very slightly over $1, and in the previous 24 hours it was trading very, very slightly below $1. So it appears to be hovering right around the peg. And so let me just touch on that. Yeah, so you can see over time, previously we were hovering between 98 99, had a little bit of a rough period at the beginning of July, dipping down to 97 some a couple of times, and then basically slowly but surely, after this 18.5% increase, there is a bit of a recovery period where that price was consistently increasing, and has now kind of settled around basically literally at $1. So that seems to be functioning well. So you can see some of the driver of that as well, right? And this is something that I say at this point pretty much every week. But stability fee doesn't determine that DAI price, right? If it did, then it would have immediately gone up to $1 at 20.5, or even previously at 19.5, it would have just sat at $1. So clearly there's more going on than just the stability fee. And so that's another thing that I wanted to kind of touch on here, is we've now entered a little bit of periodicity with what's been going on with DAI. So you can see here at the 16.5, 19, 17, 16, 17, 18, 20 levels. So stability fees increasing, DAI price is still low. DAI price comes up and then comes down a bit. Stability fee is lowered, DAI price stays relatively steady for a while, and then suddenly dips. Stability fee is increased, DAI price stays relatively steady, stability fee is further increased, and DAI price holds for a moment and then continues to rise. So essentially, if you were to draw a simple correlation, which I'm happy to show if somebody wants to see it, between the stability fee and the DAI price, it's not a very strong relationship. But if you start to use it as kind of a multivariate calc with what's going on with ETH price, it does start to make a little bit more sense. So, at this 20.5% stability fee, another thing was going on right at the same time, which was this ETH price was coming down pretty significantly and pretty suddenly. So during the decrease, and I think this is something that we tend to see over time with ETH, during the decrease, there's not necessarily a recovery in DAI. But post this decrease, if the ETH price is just holding steady, then if multiple people are not levering back up on ETH because they were already levered up, so the ETH price had risen in the June time period. People were levering up during that time. It held steady sort of at the turn of the month, and people had not cashed out during that time. So what's interesting is, had ETH price risen further, potentially people would have cashed out and leverage would have gone down. Then a drop in ETH price would have precipitated a massive increase in leverage, which would have depressed the DAI price. So these behaviors actually are what drive the DAI price more than anything. And the stability fee changes the sensitivity to those behaviors. So right now, what you have effectively is a higher stability fee, and the secondary lending picture fills in some of this gap of why this doesn't visually make sense if you just look at it. But yeah, the DAI price has been recovering, though ETH price took a big hit. And a lot
Vishesh,
of that
can I
is...
jump in with a question?
Sure.
Yeah, how hard is it to figure out how much of a sensitivity the stability fee does have in relation to the ETH price? Like, do we know that it can smooth it out by 25%, or is that going to be possible to determine without
it is
control,
possible.
I guess.
It is possible. I think some of those analyses kind of took a back burner to some of the other collateral risk stuff, but definitely it is possible. When I initially ran the numbers, I found like a very high, because it's not the same as a confidence interval, but basically a fairly reliable R-squared value when looking at the relationship between ETH and DAI price using stability fee as a modifier. So something in the 60-70% range, which is pretty good. That was prior to the most recent crash, so I could rerun it and see what it looks like with the most recent crash. But essentially, it was decent enough where you could reasonably say, and the just the relationship between stability fee and DAI price was significantly lower, like in the 20s and 30s. So it was.
I think those are the major factors here. It's not legacy inventory levels on prop desks, or community sentiment, or secondary lending platforms. It's primarily this price and stability fee.
Well, no, I mean, so this is kind of like proxies, right? So if you want to directly measure, you want to directly measure leveraging behavior, and that would give you the most direct explanation. The problem is that there's not like a very good variable you can point to that says this is leveraging behavior. There are proxies for it. You can look at some of like the ETH, USD long shorts. You can look at, some of the purchasing and selling behavior on Uniswap or something like that. And there are these proxies that exist. What I find is looking at some of those proxies is decent in terms of explaining what's going on with DAI price, but a more holistic view of like actually looking at this graph and actually breaking down, okay, when was there a run up? When was DAI price depressed? What were the trading volumes during these times? And actually like physically looking at these graphs, I find to be the most effective strategy for understanding what's going on. But mathematically speaking, you can look at some of those other indicators as well, like long and short behavior was something that we had looked at in the past. But even ETH and DAI, so this is where I had a long time ago spoken about this ratio between the short and long-term prices. That effectively is a similar proxy, right? So if you were to look at like a second derivative of the ETH price compared to its long-run average, effectively what you're saying is, when was it decreasing? When was it increasing? And then what you're looking for is a time period where it was decreasing and then increasing, and whether DAI price was affected during that time period. Because that would effectively mean that ETH got cheaper, people levered up, then ETH appreciated, and if during that dip DAI went down, and then after that dip DAI went up, that you can reasonably guess that that is a instance of people levering up and selling DAI and then cashing out and purchasing DAI back to pay down their debts. So looking for those kinds of patterns, I think, is the most reliable strategy for explaining drivers for DAI price. but even just visually looking at these things, it seems to be pretty clear. So yeah, sorry to just touch on what's been happening with the DAI price. So what's really interesting about DAI lately is there's a lot of debate around, is this caused by the stability fee, or would it have happened otherwise under a lower stability fee? Now, the thing is, with the ETH price going down significantly, what you have is effectively a bunch of stressed leverage positions, right? So a lot of traders who levered up on ETH using DAI and now have to either were liquidated or have to make a hard decision of holding on to that position and paying increasingly higher interest rates, not just on Maker, but now with the change in how Compound is calculating their interest rates, or the removal of the cap effectively, those interest rates have gone up as well, because the excess supply is dwindled to next to nothing on secondary lending platforms. So really now you actually do have a lot more exposure to the stability fee, or at least the stability fee with a slight discount, than you did before. So that really does kind of bone on bone is a concept that I've discussed before. You have less of a buffer for demand, and now people are actually starting to feel some of that pain, I feel, and that tends to put a premium on DAI and drive the price up a bit. And then, sort of what's going on with supply makes that extremely clear. So you can see here, and what I find fascinating is this you start to see some of this like periodicity and these repeated patterns, and you see the repeated pattern under an extremely different rate. So if you look back to February, March, very, very low stability fees. The DAI supply was running up fairly significantly, all the way up to 95 million. Now, March 18th, around that same time period, I'll just zoom out here a little, around that same time period, you had the DAI price was, roughly 97 cents on the dollar. So lower than what was deemed acceptable at the time, and I think lower than what we would currently deem acceptable. So the big difference is not really, but 97 cents versus 98 is not a huge difference. So the big difference, I think, is in the variability of DAI price. And so I want to show volatility here, but it's effectively the volatility of DAI is decreased significantly. And so that's a big difference between that time period versus now, is DAI was far more volatile during that time period. The supply was higher, oversupply was obviously higher, but in nominal price and supply terms, it wasn't a significant difference, right? So if I run this back through an analysis script, it wouldn't produce hugely different values. But when you plug in sort of that, and this is some of what Lix, is alluding to, is noise in the prices versus order books. But the noise in the prices is actually also an important data point to capture, right? Because those trades those prices that those trades are getting executed at is effectively what people had to do during that time period. Because more often than not, I think when people are trading DAI, they have a very high time preference for getting access to that DAI, or selling that DAI to get access to leverage to take advantage of a particular price. And so DAI, I think, is actually a very high time preference currency very often, at least when it comes to dealing with CDPs. So I think the numbers look similar, but things were actually very different at the time. Then you have sort of DAI supply running down in May, and the stability fee getting significantly increased in April, May, and then DAI supply kind of bottoming out here around 80 million. Drops of the stability fee, and at the same time ETH price running up, and then DAI supply is running up with significant amount of leveraging behavior, but at a higher stability fee. So actually comparatively a fairly stable DAI price, right? 98, 99 cents on the dollar is not that bad. So this was effectively a similar situation to what was going on in February, March, but with a different experience, I think, for those that are trading DAI. And part of that is just, a different level of confidence in the ability to arbitrage DAI. And that, I think that psychological effect is not to be discounted, but also I think less oversupply. And so at this point in time, 85 million versus before meant two very different things is effectively the answer. And so what's really interesting is with the 20.5% stability fee and just a tremendous amount of stress on people going long on ETH, right now this supply has just plummeted down to just below 79 million. I think the most recent is back up to 79 million. But you saw 5 million DAI getting wiped in a day, and then 2 million, and then 3 million, and there's repetitive behavior, burning millions of DAI each day. So a lot of this is repayments and refinancing to secondary lending platforms, as we've discussed, but also the excess supply on the secondary lending platforms had dried up pretty significantly, which we'll touch on. So this is legitimately just a destruction of oversupply. And so now I think there are very thin margins, and I think at this point likely that someone could come in and make the argument that this has actually been a dip in demand, potentially due to just stress on what's been going on with ETH, or even due to a 20.5% stability fee. This is data, I think, that indicates either holding the position or even dropping the stability fee back, half a point to see the effect. But this is strong caution, I think, against increasing the stability fee further, at least just in terms of what the data is indicating. And I think the circulation of debt tends to back this claim up quite a bit. So what you saw was essentially open debt had significantly decreased in age, and closed debt has actually increased in age a bit, so to overtake the age of open debt. Now what that effectively means is more old loans getting paid back, which we only tend to see happening. I think that's a good thing to look out for, effectively. Like on a standalone, I think the repayment of old debt is more often a good metric than a bad metric. And it speaks to circulation, which I think is good for the system. It keeps unrealized fees lower, which is obviously a mathematical benefit to maker holders. And I think it decreases the amount of risk and keeps efficiency up, effectively, economic efficiency up in the system. And this is, I think, fairly directly related to some of what we're talking about in terms of like compound instadapp and things that have been going on there. So just to quickly explain the open debt age decrease. So this kind of ties into more of the debt that's being drawn out is being drawn out from pre-existing CDPs, and less new open debt has been created recently, but more old debt has been closed out. And so that makes total sense when you consider that the DAI supply has come down from 90 million 12 days ago to 78, 79 million, which is I think one of the more significant drops in like a 10-day period that you've seen. I mean, there was similar degree of drops in the end of 2018 and in like August, when there was a lot of new stuff being released. So just to touch on your collateralization, so with this 20.5% increase, collateralization had run up with what's pretty interesting, July 14th to 19th range, because if you look at, zoom back out here, if you look at the ETH price during that same time period, it's fairly flat, actually decreasing a bit. So this is actually perfectly opposite reaction to the ETH price right around here. So people were scared, there were liquidations, and a significant amount of ETH was being locked, and then on a daily basis. And then what's interesting is just in the last few days, with the significant decrease in DAI supply, there was a fairly significant decrease in locked collateral, which kind of makes sense. And what it actually speaks to is some of those CDPs that were closed out appear to have been fairly well collateralized CDPs, so fairly risk-averse actors. And I think it's just a bit of a selection that caused this dip. The run-up was a bit of like fear and this effect, which I guess somebody else name at some point, but the counter reaction to collateral value in terms of nominal amount of collateral locked.
So Vishesh, I have a quick question about the collateralization ratio actually. So I was thinking about it, and what if a CDP holder wipes their entire DAI debt, has 0 DAI in their CDP, and they just have their ETH sitting there? So technically, and just collecting whatever the PETH appreciation rate is as people get liquidated. So like that ETH is not actually collateral. I mean, I guess it is collateralizing the system somewhat, but it's not actually backing any DAI debt. Is that significant? Is that a significant scenario to filter out of the data to get better data?
So in terms of total collateral in the system, I believe I would still be counting those cases, but most of the calculations that I do, I try to filter out for non-empty CDPs. So effectively, if CDPs have no debt, then for most calculations, they're counted out. In terms of the total pool of collateral, those are still included, but I've graphed this before. Those are pretty tail, like a pretty edge case, I think. I don't think it ETH locked with no debt makes up a significant portion of the ETH supply. And it actually makes total sense because what you're talking about in terms of the yield on just the ETH spread is actually pretty low. Like it takes it was much higher in like end of 2018, early 2019. That ratio was growing much more significantly, but
I mean, it's better than the compound supply rate for ETH. Which that's a $70 billion market. Like 0.1%. I think it's higher than 0.1% a year.
Oh, ETH supply rate.
Yeah, on compound.
Yeah. But
so we know that there's a market for like some passive yield on just ETH.
Actually, is it better than 0.1%? Because look, 1.0431 currently, and if you look at end of 2018, it was 1.0402. So it's a very slight spread. So I don't know I don't think that's like a real profitability scenario that people are chasing.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the amount of liquidation events people are forecasting for in the year. But yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I think there are much better, safer ways to cash out on ETH. But yeah, I mean, the simple answer is I don't think there's a significant portion of CDPs that have large amounts of collateral and no debt. Is the simple answer. But I can pull the exact percentage for you next time. So just to polish it off here, these secondary lending rates, this is where a lot of the magic has been going on in the past week. So I don't want everyone to like just hear, oh, DAI supply dropped by 10 million, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, because it's not that simple. It's a severe destruction of oversupply. There may be some slight decrease in demand. It would be stupid to totally exclude that scenario, but that wouldn't be the whole picture. And so if you look here, the weighted average borrow rate for DYDX and Compound has like basically come up within spitting distance of the stability fee. And it has come close in the past, and there's always kind of the spread. DYDX fluctuates above and below. Compound basically keeps the spread below. That spread was kind of sitting for a while earlier in July, but in the past week or so has come up very, very close. And that's pretty easily explicable with the utilization here. So DYDX utilization, like I said, for other reasons, fluctuates a little bit more and stays a little bit lower, because I think DYDX is kind of nestled into this use case of being a little bit more shorter term loans and a little bit more derivative, highly levered plays. But Compound is kind of like the discounted version of Maker at the moment. So effectively, like when people want to source DAI at a slight discount, they'll source it from Compound instead of Maker. If people just want to supply DAI currently, since there's no DSR at the moment, they'll just go do that on Compound. So that's kind of where that's sitting right now. But the utilization rate has shot up in the past month, and now is hovering around 98%, which is pretty crazy. So the excess amount of supply on DYDX and Compound are both very low, less than 2 million in total. And the borrow volume is just, it exploded in May, was kind of quiet in June, and then has shot up again in July. And no small part of this is attributable to, or you can attribute a decent portion of this to what's been going on with Instadap, the changes in the Compound rates, and I think just a lot of it, don't underestimate UI and awareness, branding, marketing, things like that are very powerful as well. So I think just a better awareness of the fact that you can get the same DAI at a cheaper rate has reduced the excess supply that's sitting on these platforms. And so, you can see, I tweeted about this the other day, like 38% of the total supply of DAI is being borrowed on secondary lending platforms right now. That's huge. And actually that's just DYDX and Compound. It's not counting in like Dharma, Nuo, anything like that. So that's fairly significant. I don't think something to be worried about per se, right? So I don't think there should be this narrative of like, oh, what happens on DYDX and Compound is taking market share away from Maker is not necessarily true. And that's where this excess supply comes in, right? So this has basically been like 10 million, 7 to 10 million DAI at times that's just sitting there, not being used by anyone. And so that sum, if you look at July 7th, that was around 5 and 2.5, like 7.5 million. It's come down by about 5 million. So at least what you can effectively think of as pigeonhole principle, what goes in and what comes out. About 5 million of that excess supply has come down, and so at least half of the decrease in DAI supply could reasonably be explained by an increased amount of usage on secondary lending platforms. And so that's literally just an arbitrage of people getting a cheaper rate and saving themselves a couple of points. It was like 3 points earlier, and now it's down to about a point, which makes sense, right? So as that opportunity decreases in size, the profitability of that opportunity decreases. And so I think that explains a decent portion of what's been going on with the decrease in supply. I don't think anybody should make the case that it's even, I think, mostly been a decrease in demand. I think it has mostly been an improvement in efficiency. But at the same time, now we're very, very close to the margin. I would seriously take this as a data point to keep the stability fee as is, or even potentially decrease it slightly. But again, I would caution again, and I think David was really good to point this out earlier in the call, I would caution against this sort of ping-ponging behavior and overshooting in both directions, which I think has caused some problems in my honest estimation. So, going from 19.5% suddenly down to 17.5%, and then again further suddenly down to 16.5% was an overreaction, I think. And so I would caution against doing the same thing now. I know there was some discussion of a 22.5% stability fee. I'm sure there will be further discussion about a more dramatically decreased stability fee as this price comes up a little bit, because I think, again, most of the community tends to make a fairly simple decision of if DAI price is high, decrease the stability fee, and vice versa. So I would not be surprised if a lot of people start to come out as this DAI price increases and say, hey, drop the stability fee. But what I would caution against is oversimplified thinking and chasing your own tail. And so definitely don't suddenly decrease it to 16.5%, and definitely don't increase it at this point. I think
So
what's supported
Vishesh,
is to hold it steady or to slightly decrease. Yeah.
really quickly, just so that the audio captures it, Rich pointed out in the chat that the governance poll that ended today ended with an 18.5% stability fee. So there's going to be an executive poll this coming Friday
Okay.
to decrease the stability fee by 2%.
Got it. Thanks. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to keep up with the most recent update. Yeah, so 18.5%, again, I mean, that's hopping it back to where it was July 9th. So there's actually a logical reason for doing that. I would have probably suggested a smaller decrease. And so this, I think, speaks to the exponential voting polls. I think having small, infrequent changes is most of the time going to be easier to manage for the system. And I think manageability is something to significantly prioritize for the system at this point.
So Vishesh, I have a quick
yeah.
question. That's totally relevant. It's the fact that with this decrease, if it passes, it actually is gonna, I guess, I don't know. I don't know if it's gonna like make it even more narrow or even potentially beat the borrow rate on compound. But do you see like the parity of the rates between something like compound or secondary lending markets in general with Maker to be like a significant kind of point of data?
Yeah, it is significant. DAI is inherently asymmetric, and I will say that over and over and over again. So similar to how when you arbitrage DAI above $1, it's a quick and easy thing. When you arbitrage DAI below $1, you have to potentially sit with it until it returns to peg and take on a bit of risk and a bit of time and cost of capital. So similarly, when it comes to lending, if you drop the stability fee to below the compound borrow rate, you will immediately incentivize refinancing.
People are going to use that instant leverage the other way.
Extremely predictable outcome, I would say. That would be a very, very likely scenario. The problem is doing it in the reverse direction. When the stability fee is higher, having that bridge and refinancing to compound, for example, has not always been as quick, I think, of a reaction as you would see in that scenario. I think people will be quicker to refinance back to Maker because the stability fee is a slightly more predictable rate, I think, than like compound rates, for example, or DYDX rates for that matter. So there are reasons why it would make sense for people to immediately switch back to Maker. It takes a little bit more time, I think, for people to refinance to something like compound. So again, inherent asymmetries in DAI, and I think you got to be wary of those. Similar asymmetries, I think, when decreasing the stability fee is not equivalent to increasing the stability fee, and you have to take into account very different concerns, and you have to, I think, be much more careful about decreasing the stability fee than you do about increasing it. And so there's like all these different asymmetries when it comes to understanding and managing DAI. And so similarly, I think when you're thinking about these secondary lending rates, you have to think much more carefully about decreasing the borrow rate of DAI to less than what is currently available on other platforms than you do increasing it to a rate that is higher than what's available on other platforms. Because when you increase it to a rate that's higher than what's available on other platforms, people can just eat into excess supply, and there's relatively little increased risk for the system. When you do it in the reverse direction, you're now immediately going to justify refinancings back to Maker, and you're immediately going to justify potential increase in DAI supply, and at the same time, dumping more excess DAI supply back onto secondary lending platforms, potentially making it cheaper and potentially putting more DAI back on the market, which could potentially decrease the DAI price. So it could ironically have a much stronger effect than an increase in the stability fee would have on improving the DAI price. And so I think you have to be very careful about doing that. And again, just another data point for why I would have suggested and have suggested slower, more slight decreases, even potentially keeping it 20.5 or dropping to 20 or 19.5. And so, 18.5, we'll see what happens. But small, even 0.5% changes at a time, I think make a ton of sense, and making them, slower than intra week and definitely, 7 days, I think makes sense. So every other week, 0.5%, I think is not crazy and makes a ton of sense in terms of managing the system in a smart way.
Vishesh, sorry for bombarding you with all these questions, but I have one more.
Okay.
What does the scenario have to be for borrow rates to drop on DAI, like generally speaking?
Can you clarify the question?
So currently stability fee is like 20.5%. What do we have to see? Do we have to see a change in the profile of what DAI is demanded for to see like rates drop? Let's say like if we wanted to see an equilibrium come about naturally of, let's say, a 10% stability fee on DAI, like in single collateral, because this might completely change conceptually in multi-collateral. But yeah, you get my question, kind of.
Yeah, I get the question. So I'm just going to restate in my own words what I think is effectively, when do you consider like actual data-driven scientific signals for decreasing the stability fee? And I think, one, you watch that excess supply and you watch the utilization rates on these secondary lending platforms, especially in the absence of a DSR. So to what extent is there excess DAI supply floating out around there? And to what extent can that shield the demand curve from the stability fee being potentially too high? Right? So theoretically, if you're going to lower the stability fee, it's because you're saying it's too high. You shouldn't just lower the stability fee to try to get it as low as possible. You should lower it because you think it is too high. And those are, I think, an important distinction that seems very, very subtle, that I think gets lost. But the nuance is important. So there is an equilibrium that theoretically exists. You want to manage to that equilibrium so that you're balancing DAI price, you're balancing cost of using the system, you're balancing holistic, system level metrics and level of risk in the system, so that if ETH makes a crazy movement tomorrow, the whole system isn't screwed. And so like you're balancing all these things at the same time, and that is the equilibrium point that you're trying to manage. Problem is we have low visibility on the equilibrium point. And so you use the stability fee as kind of this very indirect gain knob to try and navigate to that equilibrium point. And so when you're trying to decrease the stability fee, it should be because you think it is too high. And so then what does it mean when you think a stability fee is too high? Well, what you're saying is there's a demand curve and there's a cost, and that cost exceeds the demand curve's preferred cost. And so I wouldn't say price because this isn't the same economic question. But effectively, if that excess supply is not present or is significantly decreasing, now you run into the risk of hampering the demand curve. And so I think excess supply is effectively what you're trying to manage towards with that stability fee. So if you see the DAI price is relatively steady, if you see that excess supply is decreasing, then you can start to say, okay, well, potentially the stability fee is too high. But if everything was totally steady, if the DAI price was precisely at $1 and excess supply was not moving an inch, borrow volumes on secondary lending platforms were not moving an inch, then you might say, yes, we're at an equilibrium point, and there's nothing at this moment that justifies making any change to the system. Problem is, and this is the thing that I'm trying to caution against, I think even if we were to run into that scenario, people would want to make changes. And that's, I think, where some of the dangerous behavior comes from, is when you want to make changes when they don't necessarily make sense.
Thanks, that's a good answer. I want to keep talking, but I know we should probably get.
I'm sure Rich is cringing.
No, Rich is okay. But we it's already the hour, so we probably have another half an hour that we can go reliably. But yeah, so I think Matthew is up next if you're done, Vishesh.
Yep.
Yeah. So Matthew, you in the call? Hold on. Let's see. Oh, Matthew's actually not in the call. I think he left a bit early. Or maybe he wasn't here at all. I don't know. All right, well, Vishesh, in that case, do you want to keep having a conversation?
I'm happy to answer any more questions. I think I ran out of stuff to talk about.
So okay, I have a question relevant to the discussion we were having. So right now we see that compound utilization is super high. Excess supply, as seen on dydx and compound, has dropped. But you think that this is kind of at the margin because we didn't see a premium in the DAI price, right? Do you think we're at like a very delicate? Do you think we're like at a very delicate equilibrium point right now because we don't see a premium in the DAI price, despite the fact that this excess supply has dropped significantly?
No. So DAI price is a function of where all the markers are at and what's the volume of both buying and selling DAI for ETH and ETH for DAI. And so if there was, right, so this is what I was talking about, is the volume is mid to low range, in the 3 to 4 million range. Had it been 14 million yesterday, then you would have seen a huge run up in DAI price. Had a bunch of people decided to lever up at whatever 222 ETH price currently, had you seen a bunch of people decide to lever up at that price, then you would have seen DAI price depress significantly. You would have seen it depress significantly less than if it had been 16.5% stability fee. But with that excess supply being lower, I think now it's not about the DAI price is basically my answer. And this is, I think, the really hard thing for people to get away from is just looking at DAI price as being the be all end all. When that excess supply has soaked up, fairly significantly, I think now, as long as DAI price is in a relatively good place, right? So if DAI price had been 96 cents on the dollar, then what you basically want to say is, I don't care what the demand function is, I need to soak up oversupply today so that DAI doesn't go into some kind of spiral scenario. And so you're kind of artificially forcing up the DAI price by hoping that whatever trading activity comes along at a higher stability fee, it's going to be buying activity. And that's what you're really kind of trying to change, is the ratio of what is buying activity, the percentage of buying activity versus selling activity on DAI. So yeah, to answer your question, I don't think it's about DAI price. The reason that I'm saying I see a case for holding the stability fee or dropping it very, very slightly is because that excess supply has soaked up significantly, because DAI supply overall has come down significantly.
Right.
Because I think the demand, the amount of organic demand is very close to the amount of supply that currently exists.
Right. And you mentioned that this isn't something that's necessarily like something we should be super concerned about. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's still a little bit of wiggle room. So it's not like a extremely stressful scenario where, and the thing that I'm cautioning against being extremely worried about is this decrease in DAI supply. So I could hear, people's thoughts effectively when I saw that DAI supply go down. And I'm sure there were plenty of people who were concerned that, okay, Maker is losing usership to things like compounded UIDX. And I'm sure that's the narrative that ran through some people's heads. What I'm basically saying is that would be a premature narrative, because, a lot of the movement was coming out of basically this reserves of oversupply. So it's not impossible to think, but I think it would be primarily due to ETH price, not due to stability fee, that there was some decreased demand for leverage. And so there may have been a slight decrease in demand. That's totally possible. But that 10 million was not a 10 million drop in demand. It was at least a 5 million. Yeah, I mean, I think it was more than half, and it's hard to say exactly how much, but at least half was a decrease in oversupply and just kind of an arbitrage refinancing. I mean, I think at least 4.9 million of that was literally through InstaDApp, so or something like that. And so I think there's a big portion of your answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Can I pose a scenario that I've been like kind of worried about, and I brought it up a couple times on chat, but I'm actually really interested to get Vishesh's point of view on it, which is that Compound did not uncap their rates. What they did was they moved, or maybe it's changed since then. I could be wrong, but within the past week, their change was to move the cap still at 100% utilization. The borrow would be 20%. And what I have been thinking about is that actually creates a race condition between in any kind of a scenario where the stability fee on Maker is above the total possible cap on Compound. I worry that it creates an issue where it will always be beneficial for someone to instadap their CDP over to Compound, even up to 100% across the board. And that, in that exact scenario, lenders cannot take out any money. And I think that I worry that this could create some kind of a feedback loop in a 0% oversupply scenario, that there is actually still no reason for anyone who has lend out on, or for borrow out on Compound to take it out, but then none of the lenders can actually take it out to rebalance the system where they actually hold, a third of the die in the market, where people may need to close out their positions. Like, I actually think in a quick crash scenario, die price is heavily stressed because in a case where we are heavily leveraged, because people need to buy die to close their positions quickly, and so it is a very short window of time, but then market makers react by generating a lot of die to push that back out. We don't have to worry about a long-term worry in this, because let's say die settled at $1.05, we have plenty of cap, we can print new die and sell it to the market. But do you think that there's an issue if our stability fee is above the max cap of Compound, is my overall question.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point. And actually, this would be a good thing to clarify. When the stability fee moves down, does the cap immediately move back down on Compound? Or is it a manual switch?
No, I believe that it is a hard-coded value where they coded essentially at 100% compound utilization. They cap the borrow at 20%.
Yeah.
And that's moved up from 17 and could move in the future too, but like that's
right. Yeah, so that was kind of my point earlier, and it's a good distinction. I kind of oversimplified it in my explanation. It's not a removal of the cap, it's just a moving of the cap. But I think the effect is ultimately the same. So, if the cap is moved from 17 to 20, I don't think the fee would not be extremely likely on Compound to hit that like exactly 20 cap, even in the current scenario. I think I am more worried about the Compound or DYDX for that matter rate being being more expensive than the Maker rate, because that's an immediate, I think, effect of increasing the supply, which I think immediately is likely to flood more die onto the market, and so I think has some potential concerns, especially for the PEG specifically. But I think, especially with the absence of the DSR currently, Maker has benefited from Compound and DYDX having, more often than not, a cheaper route for obtaining die. And so this is where I kind of go back to, if the stability fee is too high, it's very, and this was a big criticism while the stability fee was being raised, 3, 5, 7, 11, 14, etc. People were worried about the demand function and the likelihood for the stability fee to actually decrease the demand for die. And so one of the big boons for Maker, I think, has been the fact that people can always obtain cheaper die, or at least in the relatively recent past, can obtain cheaper die on Compound and DYDX, because that actually helps to protect the demand function from a stability fee that is potentially overshot. And so I think it's actually in Maker's best interest for Compound and DYDX to have a cheaper rate. So I'm not worried about that scenario. I am more worried about the reverse scenario, where the stability fee is lower than the borrow rate, or God forbid, the supply rate on one of these platforms, and that immediately throws us back into like a 2018 scenario where there's some kind of screwed up incentives, and potentially some adverse effects on DIE's function. And it's very hard to unwind those, as we've seen
Wait, can you say that scenario again, where the stability fee is smaller than the supply rate?
So if the stability fee is smaller than the supply rate, that's very bad. And we go back into the way things were. I think it was end of 2018. If the stability fee is smaller than the borrow rate on these platforms, then it's cheaper to mint DAI than it is to borrow it from those secondary lending platforms.
But
which
wouldn't
I
the
think,
market auto correct that kind of quickly?
well, it depends on how quickly. What's that?
What was that, Cole?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think about them? Is it just the fact that like NFTs, like it's hard to figure out how to have a profitable NFT business, or like they like having so much trouble?
Cole, you're cutting out a little bit. It's hard to hear the question.
So, David, just to answer your question there, what I was saying was effectively it may happen, yes, but first I think what would happen is people would source DAI from Maker. That would drive up supply. DAI would get flooded onto the market. Some of that would potentially get supplied on these platforms. Borrow volume may decrease on some of these platforms, and then that propagates into their systems, and then those rates get adjusted. But
And
like
we actually saw this
going through that process
earlier in the
takes
year.
time, right?
Yeah.
What's that?
Didn't we see this scenario earlier in the year where there was an ARB where you could just borrow DAI because the stability fee was lower than the supply rate?
Yeah, so I'm even just talking borrow rate, but yes,
Okay.
there were scenarios prior where it was lower than the supply rate, and then people were inherently just minting DAI and lending it on secondary lending platforms, which
created
is not, I
excess
think,
supply.
the intent
Yeah.
of, and it's very flimsy. And
That's
so
bad
then
for the DAI peg.
when it goes onto the market, DAI price takes a hit, people freak out, stability fee gets raised. I mean, this is exactly what happened. So, but even if the borrow rate is cheaper on Maker, I'm saying there are some potential concerns to think about where I think you do have a short-term effect of DAI. Like, yes, those rates would get arbed, but in the process, DAI, I think, would make it onto the market, and the peg would potentially take a hit. I don't know how the market makers.
But wouldn't a scenario like that indicate that there is a lack of DAI supply, and that scenario is basically fixing that lack of DAI supply? Because if
it depends.
Yeah,
So
guess,
if the supply goes up and people do not refinance from secondary lending platforms, then yes.
Yeah.
But if people start to decrease the amount they're borrowing on secondary lending platforms and then go ahead and increase the DAI supply, you're basically just returning a portion of the oversupply and flooding some DAI onto the market in the process. I don't see how that's a positive. So yeah, again, I would not be concerned by perpetually having the scenario of Compound being cheaper than Maker. I think it's actually been helpful for Maker. And I think this makes sense, right? So if you start to think about DYDX as a short-term, more expensive, highly levered platform for primarily derivative plays, if you start to think about Maker as the last resort for minting DAI supply when there's not enough floating out there in the market, and you start to think about Compound as kind of this middle ground of a slightly cheaper place to borrow DAI and a place where you can lock up some DAI to get this pseudo DSR effect. These roles, I think, are what have emerged for the three platforms respectively. And I think they've been working in kind of tandem, kind of synergy. It I think is nestled and form following function. I think it's evolved into the structure that seems to work for this market. And this is where people start to talk about some of the, efficient market hypothesis and all that jazz, and InstaDApp and what it's doing. I think the structure that has currently emerged is the one that works right now.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Thanks for the really great answers. So if there's no other explicit questions or conversation that we want to have. Oh yeah, there was this one comment from Cybel that we didn't get to from earlier in the call. What do you think people think about posting their voting rationale. I think I want to do it more regularly, but do people think that it's positive, negative to the process? I mean, I have some thoughts. I think it's probably good when it's done well. I know that if like a lot of people have like a lot of text, like almost nobody's going to read it except for those people that already are commenting and giving their rationale. But for, you know, newcomers, it gives them kind of like an Amazon ratings page where they could go and make their own decision, like, oh, okay, this person is doing it for this reason. It like gives people the ability to think for themselves. So I think it's probably positive, but I think the cognitive overhead for like reading everybody's, it's a good option. I don't think it's actually bad, and I think it's good for you as a voter because it lets you put your reasoning and thoughts on paper, or, you know, figuratively on paper, and that's always actually really useful.
So,
That's my
David,
advice.
I would agree with your conclusion, but I'm going to push back on the reason a little bit.
Do it.
So I think there's been a problem in Maker governance, which is a bit of a disconnect between what the conversation is and what the votes end up being. And I think in order to have effective governance, you need to resolve that gap, or the community needs to resolve that gap. That would be my inclination. Because how do you manage something well if you're talking about one thing and doing something different? Or at least then it begs the question of are you, you know, appropriately devoting your time and resources? And so I think there's a tremendous lack of visibility into the thought processes and rationales of a fairly decent chunk of the voters. I don't often hear, you know, I hear myself talk, I hear people on these governance calls talk, I hear a lot of, you know, great posts on the forums and the chats, but rarely do they tend to be making the same case as what the polls and the votes end up being. And so what I'm really missing from my perspective as like a participant in this community is understanding really well why 18.5%? What were people thinking? Why increase it to 20.5%? Well, like where is some of the rationale for these votes?
That's the case for writing out rationale for your votes.
Well, writing out is a very specific suggestion, right? So it's like this is how you're going to go about doing this. What I'm more talking about is it may not necessarily be writing it out, because I think that's high overhead and you're not likely to force people to, you know, write out what they're thinking. But there has to be a way at some point, I think, to understand why people are voting the way they are. It doesn't necessarily have to be writing it out.
So my my thinking on this was just that, and a lot of it mirrors what Vishesh was just talking about. Like, I think, I guess what I'm thinking is, like, I would like to post it to the forum because I do feel like there's no current, like, coordinated place to talk about what you're voting or why you voted. I mean, and so I guess I'm looking, in one sense, I'm looking like, should we do the discussion afterwards, which is like, I don't say anything before, but afterwards I say, hey, I voted 19.5, here's my reasons, blah, blah, blah. Or is it valuable to do it, or do people think there's value to doing it during the process, where I can say, okay, once I've made up my mind, I think there is definitely a piece of it speaks to what David is bringing up. It's like, it helps me kind of crystallize my reasoning. But I do think that, for instance, part of the reason that I think this is important is that I'm pretty sure there's some 14,000 maker holder that is constantly voting on the rates, but is not reading, either not reading chat regularly or not reading chat at all. And so, like, I don't know the way to kind of funnel everyone into one place to talk about it, but I feel like the forum post for the current executive poll or regular poll is not a bad place to do it. So I'm just going to start doing it there, and we'll see if other people want to do something different. But like, the chat is definitely the wrong place, and it's too ephemeral. But yeah, I do think we need somewhere where we can start just to kind of funnel everyone into a discussion about it, because I do think there is a huge disconnect between how the people are voting and how the talk about it in the governance process goes.
Yeah, I think when Rich posts those threads, every time there's a vote, that's what the threads are meant to be, but they just don't get much engagement because, you know, people don't know, you know, yeah, exactly your point. And I think it would be probably a good thing. So yeah, man, good question. All right, cool. Well, I'm satisfied to end the call here, unless you guys want to keep going. I'm gonna stop the recording, so you guys could keep talking and hang out in here if you want after. Or I don't know if I leave the room if it'll kick you all out, but I think I have to set somebody a host. But here we go.